this conversation to talk about a super exciting issue about women in community leadership. And we have a great team of women that are going to talk to you about this topic. Let's start off with some introductions to talk a little bit about how'd you get into community management and how did that first initial role shape your path into community leadership. And so I'm trying to look at names because I work with engineers, so they're very alphabetical. So let's go with Katie first because I think you're alphabetically first in our list.
Great, sounds good. Well, I'm Katie Babel. I'm the Chief Community Officer at a company called Building Brave. I got into community management back in 2008 when it wasn't really a thing, and it kind of happened accidentally. This was kind of how I spent my whole career, and I went through high school and college interested in the world and being like, you know what, I want to get out into local communities around the world. I want to join the Foreign Service. I want to work for a non-governmental organization. And that was really my path and my education. And it come to find out that at that time, that wasn't really a thing that there were job openings for. And I was kind of hitting dead ends no matter how hard I tried. And so I heard about an opportunity to be a community specialist for a company that had incidentally been doing the community as a product thing for a good 15 years already, and we're kind of ahead of their time at that time. And it was something that I just ended up being really good at and realized it was a way that I could still connect with people around the world and learn from them and get those shared experiences out there. And so that's how it resonated, where it didn't have to be an on the ground thing. It could also be this virtual thing that could help me learn and grow. And incidentally, I could help other people learn and grow and kind of fulfill what I felt my mission was. So I was fortunate to do that. And that was a company where it was, a brand new community, but their flagship community I had the opportunity to take over, which was, instead of being brand new, had 2.5 million members. And so I got the kind of thrown into all of the different variables that you see within community, got the chance after that to form a consultancy with a software company and really learn about how to do everything, working with every type of community and company that's out there. I helped launch over 30 communities, but then I helped also drive and run others for Fortune 100 companies or these larger B2B, B2C spaces. And so it's been a really interesting, exciting career.
Awesome. We're excited to learn more about that. But Ashley, I'll turn to you next. Tell us a little bit about your journey.
Yeah, thank you. So hi, everyone. My name is Ashley Brookshaw, and I'm the current Senior Community Manager for NICE CX1. And I'm also the founder and CINO. I messed up my own title. What's that about? Founder and CINO of my own kind of digital consultancy. So as we kind of talk about how you get into community, I would say that mine really started while I was still in college. My background is I went to Loyola University Chicago, and I majored in advertising, public relations, and had double minors in marketing and Spanish. But to graduate from Loyola, you had to have an internship. It was a required kind of piece for the School of Communication. So me, being the overzealous individual that I am, I ended up with 9 internships because I literally interned every single semester because they were free, right? I did that free labor early on in my career. But I do believe that really poised me, for my first community job, which was I was hired at Allstate Insurance to do the corporate office that's in Northbrook, and I did their site migration of their internal community. I was hired to do that right out of college, my first job, right? So, as you get into, the community space, one of the things I remembered about that job was, when you're coming straight from school, you kind of have this zealous kind of situation, like I get to apply everything that I've learned in these classes, like in the real world, right? That's not necessarily how it goes, which I, quickly learned in a sense. But I believe that actual, my background in that first position really kind of positioned me to become a community leader in this space. Because after, launching that community or relaunching that community, I learned all about project management. I learned all about change management. I learned about the importance of having a documented use case and bringing alignment to an organization, which then kind of led me to get my master's in multicultural and organizational communication with that concentration in training and develop just based on what I had seen in that first role and in a combination of my internships as well. So following my master's, I got a project management certification from school. You'll notice there's a common theme. I'm a really big nerd and I really enjoy that kind of lifelong learning. And now I'm able to do, I've done communities from the corporate perspective. I've done it from an association perspective, so exclusive member communities. And most recently, like I said, I am doing customer support communities for my current role, which is great. And I also help my own clients get an understanding of, what is community, and more importantly, how are you contextualizing it in that business context. So that's a little bit about my journey and how I got here today.
Awesome. Thank you so much. You're so inspiring. Like I love hearing about your journey and all the things that you do. And Lace, I'll turn it over to you next.
Thank you. Glad to be here with you amazing women sharing your journeys. And there's a lot of things that I have in common with you. The first being that I would say community was somewhat accidental in my life. I started doing it also, I think, during college, but mostly outside of the classroom. I started working for a nonprofit. Like, actually, I loved working for free. And I worked for a nonprofit, and I worked as a director of the press, like of the journal, like the academic, however you call it, press for the law school I was studying at. And I eventually dropped out of college. I was a law student to lead the NGO I had been working for since 27 in Argentina, Chile, and Uruguay. So I was faced with the decision of like go back to Brazil, study law, graduate in a very good school versus lead 2,000 volunteers across 3 countries in Argentina, Chile, and Uruguay. For the record, I'm from Brazil. So I was having both a multicultural international experience, and I felt that was real leadership learning. So at the time, I thought I was learning leadership skills, which basically are very involved in community management and building. And 7 years later, in 2014, I was living in Malaysia. Fast forward, I had started working for startup ecosystem development. I actually joined Startup Grind, which founded Bevy. Bevy sort of like emerged from Startup Grind when we're creating our own software to help manage the various chapters. I was working at Startup Grind since 2012. I had founded the chapter in Buenos Aires. Then I moved to Malaysia, started the chapter of Startup Grind in Kuala Lumpur. And I was working for a company I was not very happy at in Kuala Lumpur. And Derek Anderson, the founder of Startup Grind and Bevy, said like, why don't you quit and join us? So I became the director of expansion for Startup Grind, taking care of Africa and Asia Pacific. But what matters is that 2014 was the first time a person in Malaysia told me, we need more community builders like you here. And they hired me to consult for the Malaysian government in community building. And at the time, I was like, I have no idea what they're talking about. But let me pretend, community building, that's what I do, because that sounds important. So that's when I think my journey officially started as a community builder. 2014, I started naming it as community building. And fast forward, I've been working around community titles since then. I founded my own company, became the chief community officer of that company when I sold it. It was called 8 Spaces. I sold it to Fly Spaces, like an Airbnb for workspace and creative event spaces. Then I joined Startup Genome to help governments develop startup ecosystems and worked as their director of community development. And more recently, I founded the On Deck Community Builders Fellowship, for those who heard of it, which is basically an MBA for community executives where you don't have teachers, but you learn from each other. You learn from other community professionals, and you grow in your career by learning from people who are actively working on it. Currently, I'm basically focusing on my own consulting / book hacking communities and exploring new pathways. I don't think I'm not sure if I went too long on that, but basically it was accidental. I'm a dropout, and I think it was a lucky path to learn that community was a thing.
Yeah, and your path is like so inspiring too. Like I just, this is just a great conversation. I'm really looking forward to learning more about all of you and kind of what you've done and your path and your journey. So again, if anyone has any questions, please feel free to put them in the chat. Fantastic panel that I'm sure would love to share their expertise with you. So please share any questions in the chat, and Kat's going to be monitoring that. But we'll go ahead and start off.
And Tirsa, I might just mention too, as we're going along, please feel free, our panelists have shared their journey with community. You may have a similar journey. We would love to hear yours. So anyone, please feel free to put that in the chat as well.
Absolutely. So we'll start with our first question. Have you seen a discrepancy in gender roles and leadership positions in the community industry? Do you have any ideas about what organizations can do to be more inclusive? Ashley, can I ask you this question first?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. I believe that this is such an important topic. I mean, part of my kind of bread and butter, just excitement around community is like making sure that the industry as well as the communities I'm building really have that, DEIB, mindset in the community building. So I would say that yes, in the industry, there's definitely a discrepancy. I talk about it a lot with colleagues and friends, especially now working in tech. I see that it's overwhelmingly male, as you can see. So I think that first organizations need to really invest in their people. Right. So if you have women that are in leadership positions, especially as it relates to community, how are organizations helping them foster their career? Like, are they having those development conversations? That's one piece of it. I would like to say, even as a woman, especially an intersectional, like woman of color, I actively go into spaces and get a sense of, am I contributing to these conversations when organizations are saying like, hey, we're looking for, retention, we're looking to retain different employees, we're looking to attract different employees. I always kind of start out with, well, how are you talking about, your organizational culture? Is this a place that will foster the career of a woman looking to advance? And if it's not, let's have the conversation around that. So I kind of, my goal and my approach to community building is really rooted in organizational culture. And I take a look at the industry as a whole, and I, see different companies, and I take a look at like, what are your mission, vision, values? Are you publishing, reports and statistics on your employees and what they're doing and things of that. So, I mean, I could go on about this because it is such an important topic, but just to recap and make sure I answered it, yes, there's a discrepancy. I think it's a twofold approach on how we as community industry leaders mitigate that, if you will. Some of it is going to be on the organization taking a look at their culture and fostering that inclusive workplace for their women and different types of individuals to really feel comfortable advancing there. And then it's on the individual as well. Like, make sure that you're speaking up and owning your career.
Absolutely. So Katie, I'll turn to you next. What are your thoughts on the discrepancy and how organizations can handle it?
We were talking about this a little bit yesterday, but I think something that highlights the discrepancy is the fact that we have no idea what the discrepancy actually is. This isn't something that's reported whatsoever. I remember that when I got my current role back in December, I was thinking about when I started my career and only remember seeing men in the role of chief community officer, but also not really seeing anybody really have that role because that seat at the table wasn't very prevalent yet. And one of the first things I did, because it felt like such a big deal all these years later, not only did I attain this role, like somebody decided to give it to me, but I got it as a woman was something that struck me as something that was unique. And I remember going into LinkedIn and doing a search to figure out how many women were out there that had gotten this role. Not only that, but how many people are starting to fit into that leadership role within our industry. And what struck me as I'm thinking about this conversation and looking back on that is that it wasn't that there was a shortage of women, but what I think is extremely true, and I think this is natural, is that, and I'm going to be very candid here because this is the industry and the space that I work in now. I work specifically in the empowerment of women within my community, is that we still, as a culture and even as an industry, I think this bleeds over, is that we are trained to look for the man in the room as the person who is in leadership role, who will be the first to speak, to be the person to ask questions. And I think it's harder because we have been trained, especially early on when we mostly saw men in this role or in these higher level positions, or at least being more networked within the industry as being the person that you look to. And so I don't think that necessarily there aren't enough of us out there. I don't think we're seeing enough of us out there. And that comes down to the equitable practices that we're learning from a DEI perspective on having that just be part of our everyday. And this wasn't a big thing 20 years ago. We didn't come into our careers learning and knowing how to practice diversity, equity, and inclusion and creating that level, or coming into the room and knowing that anybody, regardless of their gender, their ethnicity, their disability, could be the person who you go to for answers. So I think that that is a big part of it. But I also think something that Ashley said is really important. That's something that I'm learning working with a community of women and hearing people in leadership roles saying, is that we often wait for permission in order to speak rather than taking it. And I think it's just a matter of that. And as individuals, as somebody who's in a leadership role today or who wants to be, that we have to take our spotlight, we have to take our opportunity, we have to create the space in order to be heard and announce who we are and what we bring to the table. And as our gender in general needs to do a better job at that, not just as community builders, but regardless of what your role is.
Absolutely. And those were some great points. Lace, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I think we could keep talking about this and continue building. I think both Ashley and Katie brought up amazing points, and I love specifically Ashley's perspective on how it's based on like the cultural change that needs to occur in organizations to welcome diversity. And I feel empowered to speak on behalf of like being a woman as a minority on that specific minority, but I don't feel empowered nor capable of speaking on behalf of any other minorities. And I think that what I have learned the most more recently is that when we do not feel capable of speaking on behalf of someone else, it's because we don't need to. It's because we need to create space for them to speak. And often as organizations we say, oh, but we are open. There's room for people to join who don't look like us inside this organization. But when you don't have representation inside, when you don't have a minimum, you don't speak the language that those people speak, you don't look like them, it doesn't feel empowering. For that, one of the things that is a big challenge with diversity is to say, can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, is to say that we are pro-diversity, but my phone just rang and I apologize. That we're pro-diversity, but not taking concrete steps. And I think that first step to make sure that we incorporate diversity into our practices is to A, understand why do we want it, and B, I like to even look at it in a very pragmatic way. What is the economic value of diversity? As business people, why does diversity matter? To the very least, it would increase our market share if we have representatives of people who represent a major part of the population. So first, let's establish why we care for diversity. Do we really care for it? Let's just be blunt about this. And I'm a little bit sharp on this point, because if we're parting from a point where diversity, DI&E initiatives will fall into the same bucket that many sustainability initiatives fell on companies, which would end up like the social corporate responsibility budget would fit into marketing oftentimes, and I find that's not the right approach. So I think that first, let's establish why diversity matters, and then let's implement the cultural and structural changes that need to occur in order for us to hire and reach out to more people who look different than us. On a different perspective, now talking specifically about the community industry, I have a personal perspective, and now I'm speaking on behalf of myself as a woman, and I might be a little bit controversial in this opinion, but within the on that spectrum, we cared a lot about diversity. We were the fellowship people would come to because we looked the most diverse, and gender was one of our top areas of diversity. So we were the only fellowship that had like a vast majority of women, even without trying to. And we also had a lot of men, and it doesn't mean that we only had women, but I think there's a stereotype also that goes on oftentimes of community being a woman's job. I think that is not necessarily negative. I think that the rise of the need for collaborative work environments is not coincidental to the rise of female leadership. The female way of leading tends to be more collaborative and listening, which is why if you want to build creativity in a company, if you want to find solutions for unprecedented problems and you need creativity going on, which is what companies are going for right now, you need that style of leadership, which is why I think partially community is in a rise as female leadership is. We're talking about these two topics. So if we focus on gender only, I think there's a tendency of women being the first to come and speak of community, but there's also the problem of the bias and the problem of the way we approach it, because Katie mentioned this. I find that women often claim expertise less, and the people who come to then own the topic of are often male. No one invented community. In fact, it was invented maybe during the cave time. So whoever invented it's not claiming that ownership. And I think community is a community effort. The industry is being co-created by all of us. And I think women who are co-creating this need to make sure that we're not stereotyped as like the community girl talking about the fluffy stuff, the collaborative stuff. Let's talk about the economic value of community. And I might be diverging a little bit from the topic, but what I want to say is that I don't think we have actually a gap here. I think we have a problem of representation and who's speaking up, if that makes sense.
Absolutely, like spot on. I love that. And Aaron just put in the chat, yes. So, so that's great. And I also want to recognize both Maggie and Monique for their thoughts, and so thank you both for joining us and sharing your community journey with us. And if you have any specific questions, please feel free to share them in the chat, or you could always tag you as a presenter and you can come on if you're interested in doing that as well. So but I mean, that's like spot on, Lisa. I think Kat and I have been having this conversation for a few months now, where we've been talking about, there's so many women in community management and there's a very few in community leadership, and like, why does that happen? And Lisa, I think you really kind of hit the nail on the head as far as it being, a woman's job, if you will, and kind of how that works and how that plays out. But if there's any more questions, please feel free.
Well, we have some interesting comments too. So Jamie said, after hearing the feedback that my approach to marketing and communications is too programmatic or too collaborative, I turned into a positive to lean into what I love about comms programs, which align nicely to community. And Stacy shared that she became a community director 2 years ago and noticed most of the books and gurus are men from the gaming industry. And Monique says reiterates that community is a community effort, and she agrees about measurable impact on civil society.
I'd love to hear a little bit. Can I ask a question to both Ashley and Katie?
Go for it.
How do you approach owning your expertise and promoting yourself as an expert?
Oh, can I go first? That is such an important question. And I think that what I have is a lot of self-awareness and confidence. And the reason is because I spend so much time cultivating my craft. I'm always reading books, listening to podcasts, networking with you, like people like you, just to kind of get a sense. So when I go into an organization and I have conversations on what are you doing with community? I always ask the why question, right? I know that I have the expertise, but the way that manifests, I've kind of learned to kind of control how that comes out in the course of initial conversations, because I can be a little overwhelming. That's my own self-awareness and I own it. But when you're having conversations about, in an organization on what they have community, I always ask the question, so where's the community strategy? You may take a look at it. They don't have it sometimes, or it's informal, right? So then from an expertise perspective, I can say, oh, well, let's discuss how we can document the current strategy and see, where you want to go. It comes out from that perspective. It also comes out from understanding the business acumen, right? So that will change depending on who I'm talking to. And I use a lot of change management methodologies in this. So for example, if I'm talking to marketing, because I also have a marketing background, I'm able to kind of speak the language and get an understanding of, what are your objectives for marketing? Because I can't tell you, I've had some marketing people who didn't know that I had a marketing background to be like, oh, well, we're doing targeted emails, but I won't get into it. The system may be too difficult for you. And obviously, man. And I'm like, oh, have you used Marketo? I have too. I've done some targeted campaigns. Let's talk about that. And let's talk about how community can integrate with you with those objectives to make sure that we're all, kind of moving from the same book, if you will. So the way that I do it is I have that multidisciplinary approach, and I change the conversation or language suited to who I'm talking to. I do understand that is a little, I've seen the disarming, and I'm sure other women have had this, experience as well. I'm sure it's not just me, but it's really about having the self-confidence to be like, I belong in this room. I'm going to be in this room, and I have something to say about it. So that's kind of, I can go on about it, but that's kind of what I wanted to share with you guys. Is it's just about knowing yourself and being confident in your expertise and abilities and speaking up and using your voice. I just won't be silenced. It's just that simple.
I love that.
Okay, I actually love that I get to follow Asha now, because it totally changed the way that I thought I was going to respond to this question. And this is something that it took me years to realize, but that's why I particularly want to say it on part of this conversation, is that the chances are, if you're in a community role today, and chances are that that team isn't very big or falls under something else, chances are that you know more than most other people on what it is you do and what you have to do to be successful. And it took me years to understand that every time I opened my mouth, I was probably the expert in the room. And that in order for people to take me seriously and understand that I was the expert in the room, I had to act like it. And the more you talk and the more you say things with conviction and confidence that this is the way that things are, and this is the viable solution, and this is what we need to do to be successful, the more you'll believe it, and the more other people will believe it as well. And that's what really gets you seen and heard, is by being somebody that doesn't wait to ask to talk, doesn't wait for the space to be created for them to be welcomed into the conversation, but helps drive the conversation and starts rather than waiting for it to happen. And so I think that that's step one, as far as being acknowledged and seen as a leader and having these opportunities come your way that you can grow into. I think the second part of this is then, how do you stand out as a leader in community in general, in your company, in the industry? And the honest answer is, you just have to take a lot of opportunities, regardless of how comfortable you feel or haven't. This is the first speaking event that I've done of any regard in the last 3.5 years, because I moved into a customer experience role in the last 3.5 years. I didn't feel like I was that community person. I had a community, I had a team underneath me that did community. they were people that had been with me from different community roles at previous companies. I knew they had it. I thought that that wasn't my space anymore. And now I realize I was wrong. But before then, I would make connections. I'd reach out to people. I'd ask like, hey, I'd love to get to know you. Let's have a conversation. Let's hop on a call. I would make sure that I signed up for the panels like these, that I proactively asked about it, that I reached out and build those connections. Because ultimately, even though we don't always, and I know these exist, but even though we don't always have a clear space to go to, as a community of community professionals, we are a community, and we need to remember that we need to build that for ourselves as much as we need to build what we're getting paid for. If you want that to help better your career and you want to offset the number of, and I'm just going to say it and be frank, the number of keynote speakers in this industry that are always men, and the number of books that are coming out that are always men. And that's not their fault, and they're fantastic and they're brilliant and they have something to say, but that's where we need to help offset that in order to create an industry that looks more equitable.
I'd love to share also a comment and question that we just got from Maggie in the chat. So she says, I think as females in community management, when we are suggesting the value proposition of community to leadership or an organization community can sometimes feel like an afterthought. And perhaps that's because female skills are typically all around relationship building. So how can women in community management help highlight the power and force behind community when it's often simplified down to just being about relationship building?
Can I start with that, just also to comment on Ashley and Katie's kind of like on my own question, because I just wanted to highlight one thing that I learned asking the same question leader in the industry was that we struggle with that. I love what Katie said of like just owning the space, because why are we even asking for space? Like, you don't ask for anyone to open the door to your house and open the fridge in your house. It's your house. So we shouldn't be even asking for space. It's your area of expertise. And I often find that like the business world has been traditionally male. Let's not argue that. Like the marketing world, the tech world, the finance world. And it's natural that the language spoken in that world has been created by the group that has dominated it so far. And they speak a certain language that we have learned to speak. Not that we are separate. That might sound very like we and them. I'm just saying that it was predominantly male. And as women, I think that oftentimes, and that will go into Maggie's question, we talk about some terminology and we're talking about the same things using a different terminology. And what I think the gurus that we see speaking as keynotes, I agree with Katie, they're wonderful, and I learn a lot from them too. But what they do naturally is maybe to just talk about things as translators. They are great conveyors of a message to people who look like them and believe in them, because it's easier to believe in someone who looks like you. So, which is also, by the way, why we need more representation. Super important, but let's not get into that right now. But what I think is that, and what I've learned the most from building this fellowship at On Deck, and I had an amazing cohort of very, very old collaborative fellows who are open to experimentation. We were creating this fellowship with them actually for the first 3 cohorts, and many of them were male, many of them were female. But what I've learned the most is that the main challenge every single community builder has is that of demonstrating the impact of what they're doing in business. So demonstrating the business value of community is every community builder's impact, which turns to impact into their budget, their hiring, their resources. If community is always an afterthought, you never have a budget. And oftentimes the community people are either a one-man, woman show who are getting burnt out very soon and not getting the results proven because they need resources to even achieve results. So I think first and foremost, we have to be good translators. We have to learn from people who are speaking up community and are even those keynotes who might be male, might be female, because they might be doing a good job in translating things that we're talking about as collaboration and engagement in business terms, such as retention, and call it stickiness, call it LTV. So in a nutshell, translate into how does that translate into business impact. When Ashley mentioned like your approach, Ashley, of talking about what is your community strategy. Strategy is a simple business term. We need to start talking about metrics, strategy, how monetization, how does that drive business value? How is community a driver of value creation? Just start using business terms. Might sound like very simple, but I think this is why people who are just trying to translate what community is into traditional business terms are standing forward, if that makes sense. And that's one challenge that we all share.
Absolutely. I mean, I think that's a great point. It's like strategy is kind of like a broad term. And strategy is so important. I had someone walk in my office yesterday, like, because I'm going in one day a week, and they were like, "Oh my God, like you would not believe the strategy that we have, and like, how's it going?" And but like, so I had someone just totally complaining about that. But again, like not linking strategy to monetization ways. And I know like we've last week we had some really good conversations about that, and I really enjoyed listening to you about value proposition and like you really have to think about monetization, and business strategy, and like it's not enough to just be like, oh, we have a strategy and we'll check the boxes, which I think a lot of community managers are like, oh, we've checked the boxes, like we do this and we do that, and but it doesn't translate to business value and business proposition, which is really like the key. But Katie, you're shaking your head. Do you have anything to add to Lace's comment?
Well, I think something that this makes me think of as like I reflect back, because we talked about takeaways and having people have outcomes and how can you walk away from this conversation. And so I keep going back and rereading Maggie's conversation or question, and then listening to the conversation that followed from Lace. And I think about, yes, obviously you need to make sure that you have the data to back yourself up. We all know that. It's really hard to answer that question specifically for Maggie and for everybody on this call, because what's important depends on what type of community you have, what type of company you work for. Like ROI is translated in so many different things. You have to translate return and the way that makes sense to your organization. But I think one tangible thing that I can follow this up with, and we're talking about, leadership and helping other women in community get to that leadership role, is that it builds kind of on the last thing we talked about, which is the freedom and flexibility and the power that you have to think differently and propose new things. And anytime that saw an opportunity or wanted to do something, I put together a proposal. And I'm not talking about something small. I'm talking about like executive summary written up 5 pages. And then, by the way, I'm also going to put that in a PowerPoint. I'm going to invite whoever I deem well pleased to be a part of this meeting that I think needs to be there to help make a decision on it, despite what my role is. Like in my very first community role, that's something that I realized that nothing's going to happen unless I make it happen. And so even back then, things like webinar programs and user groups and champions, that wasn't anything that anybody did. And I remember going and proposing those things and having people challenging them and saying, well, what's the cost behind this? And how do we get return out of it? And having to be ready to think through and answer those questions and make them happen, even though right now they're no brainers. And so the things that you think that you have to do right now, that you have to prove to people, that seem obvious to you and seem like the solution, that might seem like it's hard to win people over initially, 5 years from now, that's going to be the no-brainer that everybody else is doing. So keep in mind that any vision that you have, I don't think there's a right or wrong way to do this. I feel like I've done community now for every industry and type of community that's out there, or at least work with a client that's doing it in a different way. And it does have to evolve and it does have to change. And you do have to be the person that brings the ideas and tries new things and be the first to propose and make it happen, by looking at community in a different way. Whether that's the data that you go out and pursue and try to look at or manipulate differently, or explore and be curious about things that aren't standard, that every other community professional is telling you to go measure, but this isn't one of those things. That's probably maybe the key for you. Or for me, it was, reading, we talked about this a bit yesterday when Ashley and Kat and Tirza and I were catching up, but, I spent a whole summer reading books on behavioral economics and writing down what I was learning from it and staring at it and saying, how can I apply this towards community for my clients because I was in a consultancy space at that time, and forming my own models for how to be successful at community, and then going out there and advocating them and teaching them and actually getting those things made part of platform functionality, because that was the next way that we needed to do community. So that's a very long way to say and build upon the thing that you have to seize it and you have to improve it in new ways all the time, because people outside of you don't realize how complex the thing that we do is, and how complex it is to find success, and how complex it is to get a return. And you have to make them realize that.
If I could just echo some of that as well. A lot of what I do is building community fundamental competency, because you would be amazed that when you're talking to clients or in different organizations, like they don't even have to Katie's point, they don't even have a baseline understanding of what the community is and what it can do. So when we talk about strategy, asking some very simple questions like, do you have a strategy? Or what is your one-liner elevator pitch for the community? And a lot of times they can't tell me that, which says to me that you don't have it, which means that we need to create it. What are the community values, right? So when you think through strategically, like, I know we talk a lot about, we as women, as community builders, we may be seen as like the relationship builders, the collaborative, and what is traditionally known as like the soft skills. So what I do is really kind of come in from that fundamentals. Here's your infrastructure. So what are all of the things that go into an infrastructure? You have your platform, you have your governance model, you have your engagement plan. So I break things down into those kind of digestible pieces and then explain it to people. Like to Katie's point, it sounds like it could be like a no-brainer, but some people legitimately just either don't get it because they're not open to it. There's some sort of, resistance that they may have, but I really do come at it and recommend for everyone to be like, try to break things down in those kind of more digestible parts, because it is a little bit easier for them to consume than you're coming in like you don't have a strategy, you don't have a governance model, you don't have vision. So it's like making them feel like they're part of the conversation and part of the building of the strategy, I think is really important, because as a community builder and as a community leader, I leverage, the change management methodologies, and I start building community by just building a coalition of different people from different departments. So in short, I make friends with people. I don't make collaboration optional, right? It's like, hey, what y'all working on over there in marketing or, in IT? Oh, is there a place for community? Because when you create those advocates within different parts of your organization that can bring community to the forefront of their planning, it makes it a little bit easier and really positions you as the authority on the subject.
We have some great questions. We have 2 questions that have come in that I'd love to share. So this one's from Aaron. When you've reached community manager or community director, how do you approach professional development? If there's nowhere else to go from a vertical growth role perspective, what skills are you sharpening to keep yourself, valuable and relevant in terms of horizontal growth?
I can actually share a little bit from the not personal but on deck fellowship perspective what I've learned, because literally what we established as our goal was to carve the community builder's career path. And the fact there is no the letter finishes or should ends at community director, that's a problem if it does. So we are already seeing the emergence of call it heads of community or chief community officers. There should be room for you to grow in a company where community is not an asset, but core part of the strategy, which relates a lot to what Ashley is talking about. So you should follow whatever she's writing on that sense to say how can I continue to develop my strategic skills so that I can grow into the C-level, how can I say, layer of leadership. So think about not titles. Actually, I don't like it's even a 5-year-old could bring manager, director, VP, C-level and translate and just change marketing for a community. Anyone could do that. So this is not what we're talking about. What we're talking about is that take what the community manager does. Let's say we are providing space and platform for people to talk to each other and for customers to add value directly to customers beyond product and service. For example, a community manager at Pipedrive is helping customer to customer, help each other become better salespeople, which is the same value proposition of Pipedrive as product itself, as a sales CRM. Just using that as an example to think about at a community manager level, I'm facilitating interactions and to deliver value customer to customer. At a director level, I'm overseeing operations to deliver those interactions. At a senior strategic level, I will be helping the director have more impact. So try to, in a nutshell, what I'm saying is that the skills you would like to develop, in my perspective, to grow within the community industry is to become more strategic as you grow, is to become closer to the CFO, is to become closer to the CRO, Chief Revenue Officer, and becoming partners, key partners with Chief Community Officers, Chief Strategy Officers, Chief Revenue Officers, finance CFOs and CMOs, for that sake, to say, how do you collaborate strategically to make sure that community is the core driver of business value? So it just means enhancing what you have already been doing. And I think that if the role of CCO doesn't exist in your company, then you got to create it. And every company would need one CCO in the future in order to keep their customers happy and continue and be sustainable. So that's my belief, but not every company has that role yet.
And, sure, go ahead, Ashley. Mm-hmm.
I was just going to say, like, one thing that I would charge everyone on this call to think about is, like, really when we talk about leadership, like, what does leadership mean to you, right? Because that could be leadership as an individual contributor, or it could be leadership as you are managing a team. I think that is going to be an individual journey. I can share myself. I am great at an individual contributor. I could manage a team. Not quite sure if I want to, right? So I'm still a leader as an individual contributor, trusted partner, etc. But it's like, I currently don't manage a team. I don't know if I have a desire to manage a team, right? And that is going to look different in each organizational context. So just wanted to share that forward as food for thought as well.
I think the one thing, I don't want to say something that's already been shared, so I'm trying to take a slightly different approach to this question, because the question was specifically around, like, for a community team. And so something that I've found that works really successful in terms of approach to performance and fostering performance, is do a slightly different take, is that first of all, I've been lucky to work in companies where mostly community is treated as a priority, but I know that that's hard and rare for many of us. The first rule is that you always treat community as a priority, and everybody on your team also believes and has no reason to doubt that community isn't a priority, and they show up every day knowing what their purpose and what their goal is and how they contribute to the better picture of what anybody around you is saying, because chances are, if you're in a leadership role, you're hearing more than they are, and they're insulated from hearing the rest of that. They need to know that what they do matters and can't get any doubt necessarily into their heads. They're going to know what the challenges are out there regardless, but the number one thing that they're looking for is how you show up. I think the other really important thing about specifically being a community leader is I very much prescribe to this idea of servant leadership, where I lead from behind. And in order to do that, I need to create an environment where anything I say can be challenged. Anybody can bring new ideas to the table. At any time, we could try something new, and everybody here is valuable and able to create the future of what we want to build. And that takes a lot of time, but ultimately, if you create that comfort and that environment and reward that and insulate that and have that be part of their ongoing performance and development, that's how they naturally level up and become leaders in and of themselves, because you train them to understand what it's like to take the lead on an idea, or take the lead, or realize that they represent themselves in a way where they're driving the community forward, and they come to a point of personal realization within their career and within their personal development, that they reach this confidence that they're the expert and can drive initiatives forward and grow into future roles. So that's something that I'd recommend being mindful of as well, specifically when you come to, I mean, I don't know, my entire career has basically been community teams. So some of you who've been in other areas can say like, oh no, that's the same regardless. But that's my biggest recommendation.
Yeah, I would say, Katie, I think you just described like the perfect leader in any team. And I think all of us are like, are you hiring?
Actually hiring a director role that's not posted anywhere. So hit me up on LinkedIn if you're looking.
Okay. Kat, there was another question. I know we only have about 10 minutes left, but did you want to go to the other question?
Sure. So, any other thoughts from Janie's question in terms of approaches to performance management for direct and indirect reports and the community team? Lace or Ashley, any thoughts there as well?
I don't manage teams, so I probably am not the best person to ask, but I will echo what I think Katie said. I mean, I've managed volunteer teams before, or I just, kind of collaboration. So it's really about, positioning a team culture. I think it's about, having an understanding of what is your leadership style. So I think Katie said, servant leadership. So you're equipping a culture where people feel confident in speaking up and can challenge and really have that conversation. So I could maybe speak to it more from that perspective. I think perhaps creating, if you don't have any, the team values, Katie was saying about, what does community mean? Like, why are we doing this? So that when they're also having conversations outside of your team, they're able to carry forth that message, confidently as well. So with that, I'll kind of stop because, like I said, I don't manage direct reports, but I would imagine if I had a team, start with creating that inclusive team culture, some values, making sure that they're equipped and feel supported to carry out that, message of community going forward, and bringing back some feedback on what the perception of community is from outside individuals, and incentivizing them in different ways to do that.
Yeah, I think that to build on that point, I just came from managing a team, and I'm very passionate about the concept of servant leadership Katie shared, and I found that the style of leadership that I dislike and I tend not to join ever, nor to apply ever, actually happens to have a place for some people depending on what you're achieving. Like people, like the metaphor I like to share before sharing like performance management tools, let's say, or tactics, is that concept that if you think about tango, like the dance, tango, when tango was originated, I like this metaphor because it's a male dominated traditionally dance. And when it was originated, it was actually dance between men or women, especially, yeah. And it was a game of almost improv. And they would dance and there were no set or predetermined moves. People would just propose something, based on that proposition they would make a move. It was so like improvised, let's say, that whenever a dynamic move like a leg hook would happen, naturally the dancers would kind of like stop and thank each other. Then tango evolved into this authoritarian dance, where one leads and leads the woman usually to make very crazy moves. So what I want to say is that oftentimes when you're like going towards a very, very, very like last minute deadline and you need to get something done and you want high performance and high results, people tend to resort to high performance, more like, how can I say, authoritarian leadership. But what I mean is that that only works from my perspective if once before you have aligned really well in building trust, having aligned values, making sure people care for those results as much as you do, and if before you have applied the servant leadership Katie described. So in my opinion, that both types of leadership can work. And my point here is that performance management depends on what are you trying to deliver right now. Are you trying to deliver something creative that you need people to take space to create and think and work on it on their own? Or what are you working towards, an event management kind of thing, logistics, or even like health related logistics where you need things to work to perfection? In both ways, I think that you must part from very, very specific alignment of vision, values that we're going to hold high throughout the performance on the delivery of such project, and steps that we need to take to go there. I always like making sure that people know where we're going and how we're getting there. From there, if you're tracking step by step, or if you're tracking loosely with specific check-ins that you determine with your team, I think it highly depends on the nature of what you're delivering. And there's 50 shades of gray here. That, sorry for that was a very bad reference, but there's not, so like there's so many shades of gray. There's no black and white, but as just like for the purpose of simplification here, I think the more you're trying to deliver something that has very precise goals, that high pressure, you need to deliver it within 5 days, the more specific you are, the more you track, and the more you have something where you need the creativity, the more you give space and you track deliverables, not, how can I say, KPIs, if that makes sense. So too long of an answer, but I think it depends on the project they're delivering. And in any cases, you need to define really well where you're going and what indicates success, to indicate how you're getting there.
Absolutely. Kat, you're unmuted, so I didn't want to jump on your toes.
Yeah, so we don't have any other questions in the chat, but I do want to call out that, and I think this was the last kind of point that we were going to hit, is I've been dropping some resources in the chat. Collectively, we have come up with some resources that have helped us throughout our careers. I shared some around data visualization and storytelling that I've found really helpful. One I wanted to call out is storytelling with data. There's a book, there's also a community, so I've dropped that in the chat. And Tirsa, if we want to talk a little bit about the resources as well, from anyone else that wants to share.
No, I think that's a great question that, we talked about yesterday as well, was, what resources exist for women who are interested in, leveling up in their career as far as moving forward. Even if, say, you're a person that wants to manage a team, right? Like, what are some of the resources that could help you do that and move into those positions? Katie, did you want to start off with that question? I guess we've got 5 minutes if you have anything to share.
Yeah, and I'm actually really interested to see how Ashley Lee's responds to this as well, because when I think back, I'm in the space of mentorship, and I'm thinking about like who I've learned from and the resources that I've learned from. And I started in community at a time when there weren't many resources or many people out there doing it quite yet. And we're fortunate enough over the last decade to have made a lot of ground and improvement there. And as everybody knows, there are resources out there. You probably know what they are. But specifically, as a woman, I think we rely on other women or learning from each other as like the principal resource. It comes down to people and who you surround yourself with. And so I prefer to focus on that piece, if you don't mind. And in thinking about this, I think, you see women leaders that you've reported to over time and the things that you want to emulate about them as far as what works, what doesn't. I think that understanding the leadership style, as we just talked about, that resonates with you, and then going out and researching it and understanding what that means, and going out and finding a course on the different leadership styles that resonate with you is important. Just a little weird fun fact about me, I went to a boarding school. They taught leadership like they taught math. And so for me, servant leadership, because that's what they taught, has always just been the way it is. And that's what I've always pursued. And that's what I go Google and find books on. And that's how I choose to better myself. But I'd say that's the first place to start. When it comes to being a leader and learning specifically in a community career, that's where, quite frankly, I don't feel like I've necessarily ever had anybody that I can lean on and say, I want to learn this thing from, and I want to learn it from you. Because as we talked about in the beginning, to kind of come full circle, there aren't a lot of women out there that have raised their hands that have said, hey, look at me as the expert, because that's not necessarily what we do, especially in the earlier days of community. But I think that also adds to the perspective that we shared during this call, is that anything that I've wanted to do as a community leader, and that I hope other women will do, I seize the opportunity to just do it and not be afraid of necessarily failing or people rejecting because I know there's going to be somebody that comes in and tells me I'm too aggressive or I overstepped, and that's fine. I don't care. And you shouldn't care either. But ultimately, the only way you learn is by doing and try something new and being assertive with your ideas and exploring that, because nobody gave me that space, because nobody knew what it was that I was supposed to be doing. So I had to decide what it was I had to be doing, and I had to tell other people, do rather than ask, like, this is what I'm doing and this is how I'm going to pursue it, and this is exactly why, and this is the expected outcome, and if it doesn't work, then we'll pivot, but this is the role that I'm creating and carving for myself. And so it's just about making sure that you are going out there and doing the research and spending the time and reading the books to understand how you can create your value, and then going out there and doing it. Hopefully a lot of you are more lucky than I was, in that you have female role models that are in the community space. If not, then I'm sure any of us on this panel would be happy to chat with you and help support you. I'll offer myself up, but I'm going over because I want to give time for Ashley and Lace to respond to this question too. But unfortunately, my answer is like, I didn't really have a female resource outside of leadership itself in the community space. And so you have to go out there and do the work and research and really get your hands dirty and make it happen for yourself.
I would agree with that. I mean, because I have a multidisciplinary approach to community building, I joined a lot of professional associations. Associations are great, like for networking. If you are not in a position where you are a leader right now, I can't stress the importance of skills-based volunteering. I've been doing that, oh gosh, like 10 years plus, and that's where I got a lot of my confidence as well. Like if it is a confidence opportunity, right, or a confidence challenge, do things in a lower kind of stress environment. Not to say that all volunteer opportunities are not stressful, but just put yourself out there. I mean, that's the best advice I can give to anyone. I mean, I started speaking and positioning myself as an expert as it relates to DEIB, community building, because people were asking, and I was like, well, clearly they've got something to say, or they think I have something to say. Let me put myself out there and see what happens. And then, kind of the rest is history. So recap, professional associations, LinkedIn has been great. Just start message other community builders in the space. We will answer because that's the nature of what I do. I also offer myself up as tribute. So feel free to connect with me at any time. And with that, I'll leave some time for Lace.
Yeah, I would say 2014 Malaysia, I had a group of community builders who were my friends. We would grab beer, tea together. Like we were multicultural. We were like from multiple different countries, and we had different perspectives, and we built different types of community, and we became friends. So I think build yourself a community of community builders. I also prompt myself to help you, but I might not be the person you need now. It depends on what stage you're at. I find that connecting with other people who are writers helps writers keep themselves accountable. So find other people who are in a similar stage of starting your community or community managers. CMX provides a wonderful community, for instance. And I think that learning from community builders is the best way to learn about community building, which is why I built that fellowship for On Deck. I wrote a book called Hacking Communities too, trying to share my perspective, which works if you are an individual community builder, doing it on your own, and almost like an indie community builder. That's more of my target audience, and back then at least. And getting inspired from others is, I think, the most fundamental aspect of it. So learning from each other, attending more of these events is the best resource, and staying up to date.
Absolutely. Thank you guys for sharing all of your expertise. There's been some great comments in the chat, and I'm really glad that this has helped and inspired other women who are tackling this in the future. So you guys have been an inspiration to me, and I know to Kat and to each other, hopefully. So really appreciate all of your time, and hopefully we can continue to talk and have this conversation. Kat, did you have anything to add?
No, I was just going to say, Lace, I have dropped Hacking Communities. I've also dropped all of our LinkedIns in the chat, so please do feel free to connect with us. And this session, we have recorded it, so it will be posted to the CMX YouTube channel, and we will be sharing this once it is posted.
Awesome. Thanks, everyone. We really appreciate your time. And this has just been a fantastic talk. And as far as everyone in the DC area, I think we want to do a DC event in May that you'll be hearing more about in the future.
Yes.
Thank you all.
All right. Thanks
Thanks
everyone.
for having us. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Bye.
guys. Thanks so much.